Barrett Developments had become a titan in the luxury real estate market. Towers bearing my name dotted the skylines of major cities, and exclusive resorts lined the coastlines I used to walk as a kid, dreaming about a life far from the dusty streets of my hometown. Success wasn't just something I chased. It was the foundation I built every day. People envied me. Some feared me. Most respected me. At 44, I had everything: wealth, power, and the kind of influence that let me reshape neighborhoods with a signature. But if you looked closer, if you pulled back the sleek marble facade of my life, you'd find the cracks. And cracks, no matter how small, always grow. "Jeff, darling, you're brooding again." I glanced up from the glass of scotch I hadn't realized I was swirling. Vanessa stood by the balcony, the wind tugging lightly at her silk dress. She was flawless in that effortless way that made other women despise her. Long, caramel-colored hair cascaded down her back, and she had the kind of laugh that could charm investors out of their wallets. I smiled faintly, setting the glass down on the marble bar top. "Just thinking." Vanessa sauntered over, resting her hands on my shoulders. Her fingers traced along the collar of my shirt, a delicate touch that once set my skin on fire. "You should stop thinking so much," she whispered. "It leaves you tense." I caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "It's part of the job." "You work too hard," she murmured, brushing her lips against my cheek. "I could take over some of the projects if you'd let me." The suggestion wasn't new. Vanessa had been dropping hints about getting more involved in Barrett Developments for months. I laughed softly, pulling away just enough to meet her gaze. "I think the design team still remembers the gold-plated bathrooms you suggested last year." Vanessa pouted, though her eyes gleamed. It was chic. It was gaudy. We laughed, but I saw the flicker of something else in her eyes. Disappointment. Maybe something darker. "I know how important the company is to you," she said, voice softening, "but I just want to feel like I'm part of it. Like I'm part of you." I cupped her face gently. "You are. Always." Vanessa smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Later that night, I found myself standing by the window of our bedroom, watching the city sprawl beneath me. The glow of the skyline stretched endlessly, but it felt distant, like I was standing behind glass, separated from the life I was supposed to be living. Vanessa had fallen asleep, curled beneath the silk sheets on the far side of the bed. I thought about climbing in beside her, but instead, I poured another drink. Somewhere beneath the polished surface of our lives, something felt off. But I told myself I was imagining things. The following afternoon, I met Michael for lunch at a members-only club downtown. Michael had been more than just a cousin. He was the closest thing I had to a brother after my parents passed. We grew up rough, and while I climbed the corporate ladder, Michael found his place in tech. He wasn't flashy like me, but he was sharp, and I trusted him. "You look like hell," Michael said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Nice to see you too," I replied dryly, flagging the waiter for drinks. Michael leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "Seriously, what's up?" I exhaled slowly, swirling the ice in my glass. "Nothing. Just the usual. Projects, investors, the gala next week." Michael arched a brow. "And Vanessa?" I hesitated, feeling the weight of the question settle between us. "She's fine," I replied, too casually. Michael didn't buy it. He never did. "You know, if you ever need me to look into anything." "I don't." Michael studied me for a moment, but dropped it. We shifted to safer topics: work, upcoming deals, the ridiculousness of some new luxury tower popping up across town. But as I listened to him talk, a small part of me wondered if I should let him look. I didn't. By the time the annual Barrett Developments Gala arrived, Vanessa had transformed the venue into something out of a dream. Crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, live orchestras, nothing was subtle, but Vanessa had always preferred spectacle. "Tonight's about you," she whispered as we stepped into the grand hall. Cameras flashed, and investors swarmed. "Don't let the board corner you." I kissed her cheek. "I'll behave." For the first hour, I mingled, shaking hands, accepting congratulations on recent acquisitions, and charming potential partners. Everything was as it should be. Until it wasn't. Midway through the evening, I noticed Vanessa slipping away from the crowd. She moved through the hall effortlessly, exchanging hushed words with someone I couldn't quite see. When the crowd parted, I caught a glimpse of him, Brandon Reed, one of my newer business partners. A fitness-obsessed former athlete, Brandon had recently brokered a deal with us to build luxury condos near the waterfront. Vanessa's hand lingered on his arm longer than necessary. I frowned. Michael appeared at my side, following my gaze. "You all right?" he asked quietly. I nodded, tearing my eyes away. Fine. But I wasn't. Something told me that tonight was the beginning of something else, something I wasn't ready to see. And that was the first crack I couldn't ignore. The night of the gala lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Vanessa was the picture of perfection that evening. Her champagne-colored gown clinging in all the right places, emerald earrings flashing as she tossed her hair back in laughter. She moved through the room with practiced grace, the envy of every woman there and the silent desire of every man. But it wasn't her charm or elegance that stuck with me. It was the way her fingers lingered on Brandon Reed's arm, the soft whisper at the edge of the dance floor that I wasn't meant to hear. I convinced myself I was imagining things. Vanessa had always been flirtatious. It was part of who she was. She enjoyed attention, but that didn't mean anything. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. But doubt, once planted, has a way of spreading like rot beneath the surface. A week after the gala, I wrapped up a meeting downtown earlier than expected. Traffic along Michigan Avenue was light for once, and I arrived home around 3:30 in the afternoon, an unusual time for me. The estate was quiet when I stepped through the front door, the faint strains of classical music drifting in from the back patio. Vanessa liked to sit by the pool in the afternoons, sipping something cold while she flipped through glossy magazines. I set my briefcase down and wandered toward the kitchen. The marble countertops gleamed under the late afternoon light, and there, sitting casually by the sink, was her phone. Unlocked. I hesitated, fingers hovering just above the screen. I don't know what compelled me to pick it up. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe the cracks had been forming longer than I realized. When I tapped the screen, a text notification popped up immediately. Brandon Reed. Same time Friday? Can't stop thinking about you. The words hit like a cold slap. I gripped the counter with one hand, staring at the message for longer than I should have. There wasn't even an attempt to hide it. No vague wording, no secret codes. It was blatant, shameless. I swallowed the lump in my throat and scrolled up. The messages painted a picture I wasn't prepared to see. Midnight at the Ambassador's Suite, Park Regent Hotel. Brunch after your Pilates class at Southgate Grill. I'll book the private room. Can't wait to see you tonight. Usual spot by the marina, after dark. Every word chipped away at the foundation I thought my marriage was built on. By the time I set the phone down, my hand was shaking. Vanessa didn't just cheat. She paraded it in plain sight. I didn't confront her that day. Instead, I let Michael's words echo in my mind. Words he'd spoken to me over drinks just weeks prior. "Jeff, if you ever feel like something's off, you call me," Michael had said, swirling a glass of bourbon at our usual spot at Adler's Lounge. "Don't play this by instinct alone. Get proof. And when you do, burn the whole thing down." I didn't want to believe Michael had been right. But now, I needed to know exactly how deep this went. Michael wasted no time after I called. "I know a guy," he said the next day over coffee at Lennox & Company, a sleek cafe downtown where lawyers and developers like to network. "He's quiet. Former PI. I trust him. Will he keep this discreet?" I asked, voice low. Michael smirked over the rim of his cup. "That's what he gets paid for." 2 days later, Michael arranged for surveillance. I didn't know the details. I didn't want to. I just needed answers. By the end of the first week, the reports were disappointingly normal. Vanessa followed her usual routine: Pilates at Southgate Athletic Club, lunches with friends at the Palms, shopping sprees along Michigan Avenue. But by the second week, the cracks widened. The PI's report came in on a Thursday evening. Vanessa had been spotted at the Park Regent Hotel, a 5-star landmark known for its ambassador suites. Brandon Reed was with her. They left through the back in trance, Vanessa wearing oversized sunglasses and a coat draped over her shoulders. That night, I sat in my office with the report in hand, rereading the details until the words blurred. She's sleeping with him, I muttered under my breath, the realization heavy. But Brandon wasn't the only one. 3 days later, the PI reported a second affair, this time with Derek Klein. Derek was a senior board member at Barrett Developments, someone I had trusted with multimillion-dollar projects. Vanessa met Derek at Lakeview Marina late at night. They stayed aboard his yacht until sunrise. I closed the file, staring at the wall. She's not just cheating, Michael said later that evening when I showed him the documents at the Griffin, an upscale bar we frequented. She's targeting people who can sway decisions at Barrett Developments. She's consolidating influence, I replied, my voice tight. Michael nodded, jaw clenched. Jeff, this isn't just personal. She's playing for control. I leaned forward, gripping the edges of the bar. She wants the company, I whispered. That night, I lay in bed beside Vanessa, staring at the ceiling while she scrolled through her phone. The faint glow of the screen lit her face, highlighting the soft curve of her lips. What are you thinking about? She asked suddenly, turning to face me. Work, I replied easily, masking the storm inside. Vanessa smiled lazily. You think about work too much. I keep telling you, let me help. I could take on some of the pressure, you know? I studied her, watching the way she blinked innocently. I'll think about it, I said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She curled into me, but as her breathing evened out, I lay awake for hours. I saw her clearly now. Vanessa wasn't just betraying me. She was dismantling me, piece by piece. And she didn't know that I had already started dismantling her in return. Chapter 3. The Rot Beneath the Surface. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a house that wasn't mine anymore. Like someone had rearranged the furniture while I was out, just enough to make me feel off balance. Vanessa moved through our home with the same elegance and charm she always had. But now I saw the cracks that lay beneath the surface. She kissed me goodbye every morning and told me she loved me every night. But I knew. And soon, I would know everything. The investigation deepens. Michael's guy, his name was Trevor, I eventually learned, was relentless. By the third week, he had compiled a file thicker than the contracts I signed for skyscrapers. Photos, hotel receipts, timestamps. It was all there, spread out across my desk like a grotesque art project. Vanessa wasn't just sleeping with Brandon Reed and Derek Klein. She was juggling at least 4 men, each playing their role in whatever twisted game she thought she was winning. Trevor's notes were meticulous. March 14th, Vanessa met Brandon at the Park Regent Hotel, left at 2:14 a.m., returned home by 3 a.m., entered through the side gate. March 17th, 8:45 p.m., dinner reservation at Augustus Prime Steakhouse with Derek Klein. Left separately, reconvened at his penthouse on Lakeshore Drive. Stayed until 11:50 p.m. March 20th, midday yoga at Southgate Athletic Club. Left in Derek's Porsche, drove to his summer estate in Evanston. Photos attached. March 22nd, 10:30 p.m., seen at the Marquee, VIP section, with Bryce Holloway, personal trainer from Southgate. Bryce Holloway. That one made me laugh out loud, cold and bitter. I had paid for Bryce's personal training services for Vanessa's birthday the year prior. A luxury trainer, well known among the wealthy wives who frequented Southgate's private athletic club. Apparently, she enjoyed his services more than I anticipated. Michael sat across from me in my office the night I finished reading the reports. The skyline glittered behind him, but the weight between us left little room for pleasantries. She's not even trying to hide it, I said, pushing the files across the table. Michael took a sip of his drink. Neat bourbon, no ice. She doesn't think you'll look. Women like Vanessa, they count on your pride keeping you blind. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. It's not just Brandon and Derek. Bryce too. How the hell did I miss this? Michael arched a brow. Because you didn't want to see it. I exhaled sharply, rubbing the bridge of my nose. She's reckless, Michael continued, tapping the folder. That's her weakness. For men? That's bold, even for Vanessa. You give this enough time, she'll bury herself. I wasn't interested in waiting. How far do you want to take this? Michael asked quietly, his eyes searching mine. I thought about that for a long moment. Far enough that she regrets it, I replied. I decided to pay a visit to Southgate Athletic Club myself. It was one of those exclusive places, high-end, all glass and steel, overlooking Lake Michigan. Membership wasn't something you applied for. It was something you inherited. Vanessa spent most of her afternoons there, a routine I had barely paid attention to until now. I entered the lobby, flashing my member's card at the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with a tight bun and an apologetic smile, recognized me immediately. "Mr. Barrett, welcome," she greeted, but there was hesitation in her eyes. "Mrs. Barrett is currently in the private training wing." I already knew that. "I'm not here for Vanessa," I said smoothly. "Just need to check on a few things." She nodded, relief flooding her face. I wandered toward the training area, pausing by the glass wall that overlooked the private suites. There, in the far corner, I saw Bryce. Tall, chiseled, the kind of guy who never wore a shirt if he didn't have to. He was stretching Vanessa out on a mat, his hands lingering on her waist in ways that had nothing to do with fitness. I clenched my jaw. By the time I turned away, I had seen enough. Trevor followed Vanessa to Augustus Prime's steakhouse later that evening. She wasn't alone. Derek Klein slid into the booth across from her, his hand grazing her thigh beneath the table as they whispered over a bottle of wine. Trevor's photos were sharp, crystal clear. By the time dessert arrived, Derek leaned across the table, tucking a lock of her hair behind her ear. Vanessa laughed, tilting her head just so, the way she used to with me. They left separately, but Trevor followed. Vanessa drove her black Mercedes to Lakeshore Tower, where Derek's penthouse overlooked the entire city. She didn't leave until nearly midnight. I stared at the photos when Trevor dropped them off, feeling something cold settle in my gut. Michael flipped through the images beside me. "She's playing all of them. She's playing me." The affairs weren't random. That became clear quickly. Vanessa wasn't just sleeping around. She was targeting influence. Brandon Reed was my newest development partner. Derek Klein had significant sway over Barrett Development's board, and Bryce had access to private details about my schedule and personal life. "She's consolidating power," Michael said, confirming what I already suspected. "She's positioning herself," I added grimly. Michael leaned back, arms crossed. "You think she wants the company?" I nodded. "She's planting seeds," I continued, convincing the board I'm distracted or unstable. If she can turn enough of them, she could push me out. Michael's eyes darkened. "She'd bleed you dry in the divorce. Take half the assets and the company in the process. Not if I stopped her first." I didn't confront Vanessa right away. Instead, I let her continue digging her grave. Michael and Trevor stayed on the case, trailing her movements between private dinners, hidden affairs, and secret meetings. But I started planting seeds of my own. I met privately with key board members, casually reinforcing their trust in my leadership. I shifted power structures within the company, limiting the influence Derek had and expanding Michael's role. By the time Vanessa realized the net was closing, it would be too late. The game had started, and I intended to win. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening, wrapped in the kind of silence that precedes a storm. I arrived home late from a board meeting that ran over schedule. The estate was unusually quiet, save for the faint hum of the fountain outside. I could hear the distant echoes of Lucy and David, our children, laughing upstairs as they played. It was one of those rare moments of peace in the house, the kind I had taken for granted far too often. Vanessa wasn't in the kitchen or the living room. Her car was parked in the driveway, but the lights in her side of the house were dim. As I passed the patio doors leading to the pool, I heard voices, soft but distinct. I shouldn't have stopped. I should have kept walking. But something in their tone pulled me to the edge of the glass doors, just far enough to hear. "She's out of town next weekend," Vanessa said, her voice low. Derek's chuckle followed. "Good. I don't want to deal with her watching us." "Her. Lucy. My daughter." I gripped the edge of the doorframe, heart hammering in my chest. "She's been asking questions," Vanessa continued, swirling what I assumed was wine. "I think she's starting to figure things out." Derek's response was too faint to catch, but Vanessa's laugh sliced through me. "She's 8, she said dismissively. "She'll forget about it." Lucy had seen something, and Vanessa's only concern was making sure she ignored it. I felt the sharp twist of betrayal dig deeper. This wasn't just about me anymore. I slipped away before they could notice me, retreating to my office and locking the door behind me. The whiskey bottle on the shelf called to me, but I ignored it. Instead, I sat at the edge of my desk, staring blankly at the framed family photo from 3 summers ago. Lucy in my arms, David laughing beside Vanessa on the beach. That image didn't exist anymore. The Vanessa in that photo was long gone, replaced by someone colder. Someone I didn't recognize. I took out my phone and dialed Michael. He answered on the second ring. Jeff. She's involving the kids now, I said quietly. Michael's tone darkened. What happened? I relayed the conversation I had overheard, every word feeling heavier as it left my mouth. She's careless, Michael said, his voice tight. That's going to be her downfall. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. It's not just about her anymore. I need to make sure Lucy and David are protected from this. Michael hesitated. You're ready to end it? Yes. Michael's voice lowered. Then let's make sure when this falls apart, she has nothing left. Over the next week, I began laying the foundation for Vanessa's undoing. Michael and Trevor expanded the investigation, not just following Vanessa, but digging into Derek's background and Bryce's financials. I wanted to know everything. What Trevor uncovered was worse than I expected. Bryce had been accepting money directly from Vanessa, regular transfers under the guise of consultation fees. Derek, meanwhile, had moved assets out of Barrett Developments into a holding company Vanessa had set up. Quietly, subtly. The most damning discovery, however, was Brandon Reed. Trevor caught him at the Sable Meridian Hotel, not with Vanessa, but with Vanessa's lawyer. It wasn't just infidelity anymore. It was coordinated. She was planning a divorce, one designed to take half of Barrett Developments with her. Michael leaned over the files spread across my desk, shaking his head. She's 3 moves ahead. Not anymore, I replied coldly. I wasn't going to confront Vanessa. Not yet. She would see it coming. Instead, I planned to dismantle everything from beneath her. Lucy had always been perceptive. Too perceptive for an 8-year-old. David, at 5, was more blissfully unaware, wrapped up in video games and soccer practice. But Lucy saw things. That Saturday afternoon, I found her sitting by the koi pond, knees pulled to her chest as she tossed pebbles into the water. Hey, sweetheart, I said, lowering myself onto the stone bench beside her. What are you doing out here alone? She shrugged, thinking. I watched her for a moment. About what? Lucy hesitated, glancing up at me with eyes that mirrored my own. Mom. The breath caught in my throat. What about her? I asked carefully. She's different lately, Lucy murmured, tracing circles on the stone. She acts weird when you're not around. And sometimes I hear her on the phone with people she doesn't want me to know about. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer. You don't need to worry about that, Luce. I've got it handled. She looked up at me, frowning. You promise? I met her gaze and nodded. I promise. David ran by moments later, shouting something about needing help with his Nintendo Switch. Lucy's face brightened, and just like that, she was 8 again. But I knew that wasn't the last of her questions, and I needed to make sure that when the truth finally came out, Lucy and David wouldn't bear the weight of it. Vanessa didn't know I was watching. She didn't know about Trevor or the documents Michael and I had compiled, but she felt something shift. She became more distant, spending nights away under the excuse of girls' weekends or late charity events. I pretended not to notice, but one night, as I stood outside the patio again, I heard her whispering on the phone. Michael's suspicious. He's been asking questions. She wasn't talking about my Michael. She meant Derek. I stepped back into the shadows, letting her words hang in the air. I need to make sure Jeff doesn't find out until after the board meeting, Vanessa continued. If he suspects, the vote won't go through. The vote. Vanessa wasn't just after my company. She was planning to have the board force me out. I retreated to my office that night, the weight of it pressing down hard. She thought she had me cornered, but she had no idea that the board was already on my side. I poured a glass of whiskey, settling into my chair. I wasn't going to stop her from digging. I was just going to make sure she didn't notice the hole beneath her feet until it was too late. Vanessa moved carefully. Her plan wasn't loud or aggressive. It was subtle, like poison slipped into a drink drop by drop. At first, it felt like paranoia. Board members I had worked with for years, people who trusted me with billion-dollar projects, started asking odd questions. Small, innocent inquiries disguised as concern. "Jeff, I've been hearing things," Derek Klein said during a casual lunch at Belvedere's, an upscale bistro in River North. He was sitting across from me, swirling a glass of Pinot Noir lazily in his hand. "Are you doing all right?" I glanced up from my steak, brow furrowed. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" Derek leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't want to intrude, but Vanessa mentioned you've been off lately." "Off?" I repeated, setting my fork down carefully. "She said you've been drinking more," Derek continued, tone laced with faux sympathy. "Canceling meetings. Missing deadlines." I forced a smile, though something in my gut twisted violently. "I haven't missed a single meeting. You and I negotiated the Madison project together last week." Derek shrugged. "I know, but she's worried." I thought I'd ask. I leaned back in my chair, studying him closely. Derek's poker face was good, but not perfect. I could tell he knew more than he was letting on. The staged incident started shortly after. One afternoon, I walked into my home office to find an open bottle of whiskey tipped over on my desk, spilling onto legal documents. I hadn't touched whiskey in months. Another time, a housekeeper found an unlabeled bottle of pills in my nightstand. I stared at it for what felt like hours before flushing the contents down the toilet. Vanessa played the role of the worried wife flawlessly. "Jeff, you forgot to take your briefcase this morning," she said sweetly one day, holding it out at the front door as I prepared to leave. "I didn't forget," I replied, narrowing my eyes. "I didn't need it." Her eyes softened in mock concern. "You've been so distracted lately. I'm starting to worry." I kissed her on the cheek, feeling the bile rise in my throat. She knew exactly what she was doing. The first real crack in her plan appeared when Michael called me late one evening. "Jeff," he said, his voice tense over the line. "I've been digging." I leaned against the railing of the balcony, watching the Chicago skyline flicker under the stars. "And it's worse than we thought," Michael continued. "Vanessa's not just cozying up to the board. She's feeding them stories, planting doubts about your ability to run the company." I tightened my grip on the phone. "I know." Derek's already started asking questions. "That's just the surface," Michael said grimly. "I overheard Vanessa talking to Bryce at Southgate. She mentioned moving certain assets under her name. She's positioning herself to take over Barrett developments once you're out of the picture." The air grew colder. "She's planning to have you declared mentally unfit," Michael added, voice dropping even lower. "She's working with Derek and Brandon. The pills, the stage drinking. They're going to present it to the board as evidence that you're spiraling. If they can force a psychiatric evaluation, they'll have grounds to institutionalize you temporarily. And while I'm locked away, they strip the company," I finished. Michael exhaled sharply. "Exactly." I stayed silent for a long moment, staring down at the city lights. "How much time do I have?" I finally asked. "Not much," Michael replied. "They're pushing for a board meeting in 3 weeks. Vanessa's already pressuring them to vote on leadership restructuring." I felt the slow burn of rage crawl under my skin. But anger wasn't the answer. "Not yet. I want everything," I said, voice cold and sharp. "Emails, phone calls, bank transfers. Whatever Vanessa and her lovers are planning, I want to know it all." Michael's tone shifted. "I'm on it." 2 days later, Michael caught a break. Vanessa had gotten careless. Michael followed her to the Hayworth Hotel, a sleek glass tower reserved for Chicago's elite. He watched as she entered one of the penthouse suites, Brandon waiting for her at the door. An hour later, Derek arrived. "They're coordinating," Michael told me over the phone, his voice brimming with disgust. "This isn't just a fling, Jeff. They're working together." I clenched my jaw, forcing my hand to remain steady as I poured myself a drink. "They're holding a meeting at the Sinclair Club this Thursday," Michael continued. "I managed to get a reservation close to their table. I'll record everything." I smirked despite the anger simmering beneath my skin. "Perfect." On Thursday evening, Michael sat 2 tables away from Vanessa, Brandon, and Derek at the Sinclair Club, an exclusive, dimly lit speakeasy downtown. A discreet microphone hidden inside his cufflink recorded every word. Vanessa leaned across the table, swirling her wine glass. "Jeff's becoming more unpredictable," she said softly. "Last night he couldn't even find his keys. I think the board is ready to listen." Derek chuckled. "Once we get him declared unfit, the company will stabilize. Brandon and I can divide assets between our divisions." "And the properties?" Brandon asked, raising an eyebrow. Vanessa smiled. "Already in motion. Jeff won't even know they're gone." Michael's hand curled into a fist beneath the table, but he stayed silent, letting them continue to bury themselves. When he left the club that night, he had everything I needed. The next morning, Michael handed me the recordings. I sat in my office, listening to every word, every arrogant plan, every laugh at my expense. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt something colder. Vanessa thought she was winning. She had no idea the game had just changed. It was a Friday afternoon when Michael called. His voice was tight, and I could hear the faint rustling of papers on his end of the line. "Jeff, I need you to meet me," he said without preamble. I sat in the office of Barrett Developments, the city skyline stretching out in front of me. The floor-to-ceiling glass gave a panoramic view of downtown Chicago, my empire laid out in steel and glass towers. "What's going on?" I asked, sensing the weight behind his tone. "You're not going to want to hear this over the phone," Michael replied. "Meet me at Adler's in an hour." Adler's Lounge was a quiet bar on the top floor of the Bellamy, one of my earlier projects. Dimly lit and discreet, it had always been our go-to spot for business discussions that didn't belong in boardrooms. "I'll be there," I said, already grabbing my coat. Michael was waiting at a booth near the back corner, a half-empty glass of bourbon in front of him. His eyes were fixed on the skyline through the window, but they flicked to me as I approached. "Whiskey?" he asked as I slid into the seat across from him. "Just tell me," I replied. Michael exhaled, placing a thick envelope on the table. "You're not going to like it." I opened the envelope and pulled out a series of documents, printouts of emails, property sale agreements, and, most damning of all, a flight itinerary. Vanessa Barrett, one-way flight to Barcelona, Spain. Scheduled for 3 weeks from today. First class, direct from O'Hare. The accompanying paperwork was worse. Vanessa had been quietly liquidating assets, properties I didn't even realize were on the market. The Southport luxury condos downtown, 2 vacation properties in Aspen and Naples, and even smaller assets like commercial spaces I had acquired over the years. "She's selling them under shell companies," Michael said, tapping the papers. "One of her lovers, Derek, has been helping her reroute the funds. I traced some of the transfers. They're going to offshore accounts in Switzerland." I stared at the papers, the muscles in my jaw tightening. "She's not just cheating," Michael added. "She's planning to leave with everything. The kids, your money, the properties." I set the papers down carefully, folding my hands on the table to steady myself. "And the board?" Michael leaned back. "Derek's been swaying a few of them. Vanessa's hoping to push the vote through at next month's meeting. If they claim you're unfit, they'll start the process of having you replaced." I kept my gaze fixed on the skyline, watching the lights of the city flicker against the darkening sky. "She's going to blindside you," Michael said quietly. "Once the vote passes, she's on the next plane out." I nodded, swallowing the anger that threatened to rise. I couldn't let it consume me. "Not yet. Does she know you've been looking into her?" I asked. Michael shook his head. "She's careful, but not careful enough." I took a long sip of the whiskey the waitress had just placed in front of me. The burn felt grounding. "Then let's keep it that way," I said calmly. "We're not stopping her." Michael frowned. "You're just going to let this happen?" I glanced at him, a slow smile curling at the corner of my mouth. "No," I said. "I'm going to let her think she's won." Over the next week, Michael and I worked quietly behind the scenes. I met with Daniel Royce, my personal attorney, and laid out the situation. Daniel had been with me through thick and thin. He knew exactly how to operate discreetly. "She's trying to liquidate the assets under your name," Daniel said after reviewing the documents. "Legally, she's skirting the line. But it won't hold up if we intercept before the transactions finalize. Let her continue, I said. But I want to divert the proceeds before she can access them. Daniel nodded. We can reroute everything through holding accounts in your name. By the time she tries to withdraw, the funds will be locked. As we finalized the details, Michael worked on another angle, gathering dirt on Derek. He's not as clean as he thinks, Michael reported one afternoon from my office. Turns out Derek's been under investigation for tax fraud. He's been moving money around, and if this sale goes through, it'll drag Vanessa into it. Perfect. It started with a single email, one I sent to Michael late one evening from my office at Barrett Developments. The subject line was simple: time to move forward. Michael responded within minutes. Michael, you sure about this? Me? I'm done playing defense. I sat there for a long moment after sending it, staring at the skyline. Vanessa had spent months building her little empire, crafting the illusion of control. She thought she could manipulate everyone. Me, Derek, Brandon, even the board. But what she didn't understand was this: Barrett Developments wasn't just a company. It was a machine I'd built from the ground up, and I knew how to dismantle it just as easily as I had constructed it. The following morning, Michael and I met at the Stanton Club, a private members-only lounge downtown, tucked discreetly between glass towers that reflected the early sunlight. Michael greeted me with his usual smirk, but there was a sharpness in his eyes. So, what's the play? I took a sip of black coffee, leaning forward. We're going to give Vanessa exactly what she thinks she wants. Just enough rope to hang herself. Michael grinned. You always were the generous type. I slid a file across the table, Trevor's latest surveillance report. It outlined Vanessa's most recent escapades, including a rendezvous at the Bellamy Suites the previous Thursday. Brandon Reed? Michael asked, scanning the file. I nodded. He's still in the picture, but she's expanding. Michael's eyes narrowed. Derek wasn't enough? She's sleeping with 3 other men, I said flatly. Bryce Holloway, her trainer at Southgate Athletic Club, and Charles Langley, an investor out of New York. And then there's Richard Evans. Michael glanced up sharply. Evans? From Evitech? The same. Michael whistled low. She's not playing small time anymore. Richard Evans was a competitor, a quiet but dangerous presence in the real estate market. If Vanessa was getting cozy with him, she was laying the groundwork for something much bigger. She's consolidating power, I said, clasping my hands together. But I'm going to turn it against her. The first leak was subtle, just a few compromising photos of Vanessa and Brandon, taken at the Halston, a boutique hotel near the Riverwalk. Trevor had snapped them from a distance, but the shots were damning. Vanessa, in a black dress that wasn't subtle, her hand lingering on Brandon's thigh in the lounge. A kiss, discreet but obvious enough for anyone to piece it together. I forwarded the images to an anonymous account, chicagoinsidertips@gmail.com, one that Michael had set up specifically for this. Within hours, the photos were making rounds on social media, carefully seeded into online gossip forums. The following morning, Chicago Elite ran a feature with the headline, Vanessa Barrett's Secret Affair, spotted with business partner Brandon Reed at the Halston. I sat at the breakfast table as Vanessa scrolled through her phone, her fingers tightening around the screen. This is ridiculous, she muttered, swiping aggressively. I watched over my coffee. Something wrong? She glanced at me, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Just gossip rags. You know how they are. I nodded, taking another sip. People will believe anything these days. Her laugh was strained. The second leak wasn't as kind. Emails between Vanessa and Derek, full of thinly veiled business deals and flirtatious exchanges, were forwarded to the Tribune. Carefully selected excerpts hinted at insider trading, suggesting Vanessa had used Barrett Development's confidential information to nudge certain property acquisitions in Derek's favor. Michael joined me at my office that evening as I skimmed the emails one last time before pressing send. This is brutal, he said, leaning back in his chair. It's not just infidelity anymore. This could tank her socially. That's the point, I replied. 2 days later, the emails were published under the headline, Behind Closed Doors, Vanessa Barrett's Questionable Deals with Board Member Derek Klein. Vanessa confronted me that night, storming into my study after dinner. Do you know anything about this? She demanded, tossing her phone onto my desk, the article glowing on the screen. I leaned back calmly. Should I? Her eyes narrowed. This isn't real, Jeff. They're twisting things. Derek and I. Vanessa, I interrupted, my tone dangerously soft. I don't care what you and Derek were doing. I care about the company. She paused, searching my expression for any sign of suspicion. I gave her none. If you're being careless with company information, you're going to lose more than just Derek's attention, I added. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not stupid. Good, I replied, picking up her phone and handing it back to her. Then let's keep it that way. Vanessa's relationship with Richard Evans was trickier to pin down. He wasn't someone who flaunted his personal life, but Trevor eventually caught them meeting at the Crescent Hotel, a high-end spot on the Gold Coast. Michael and I watched the surveillance footage one evening at the Stanton Club. She's bold, Michael remarked as Vanessa slipped into Evans' car after dinner. Overconfident, I replied. That's going to cost her. I arranged for the footage to be delivered directly to Barrett Development's board members, anonymously, of course. By the end of the week, whispers circulated through the office. Michael texted me late Friday night. The board's nervous. Derek's seat is already shaky. Vanessa's name is mud. I smiled at the message, watching the city lights flicker outside my office window. Good. Let it simmer. The real bomb, however, was waiting for the gala. I had Trevor dig into Vanessa's medical records, nothing too invasive, but enough to suggest she had been experiencing bouts of anxiety and paranoia. With the right cocktail slipped into her drink at the event, it wouldn't take much for her to spiral in public. The pieces were falling into place. And Vanessa had no idea she was walking directly into the trap. The day of the vote felt like the calm before a storm. Barrett Development's quarterly board meeting was being held at the Stanton Building, one of our newer high-rise projects downtown. The top-floor boardroom, with its glass walls and panoramic view of the city, felt too grand for what was about to unfold. Vanessa had been preparing for this day for weeks, maybe months. She believed that today's vote would mark the beginning of my fall and her rise to power. I knew better. I had let her believe she was winning, dangling just enough bait to keep her distracted while I built the walls around her. But first, there was one final performance to put on. The evening before the vote, Vanessa and I sat in the expansive master bedroom of our estate. She wore a silk robe, sipping wine by the fireplace, eyes flickering with anticipation. You seem relaxed, I said, unbuttoning my shirt near the walk-in closet. She smiled faintly, stretching her legs across the chaise lounge. Why wouldn't I be? Tomorrow will be interesting. Interesting, I repeated, stepping closer. I could smell the perfume she wore, delicate but laced with something sharp. I've worked hard for this, she said, swirling the glass in her hand. You'll see that it's for the best. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. The arrogance in her voice made something dark flicker inside me. I knelt beside her, trailing my hand along the edge of her robe. I suppose I should make the most of tonight, then. Vanessa's lips curved slightly, but she didn't stop me as I tugged the robe's sash loose. She pulled me toward her with a roughness that surprised me. It was a clash, desire and disdain tangled together, manifesting in the way we consumed each other that night. She arched beneath me, nails digging into my back, gasping my name with the same mouth that whispered plans to betray me. It was the last time I would touch her. By morning, she would belong to no one. The next day, Vanessa arrived at the Stanton Building in a white Prada suit, powerful, crisp, calculated. She walked ahead of me toward the boardroom, her heels clicking against the marble floors with a confidence that hadn't been there months ago. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. By 1:30, the boardroom was already filling with Barrett Development's most influential figures, Derek Klein's empty seat glaring from the far end of the long oak table. Vanessa exchanged pleasantries with key members, her smile as sharp as the stilettos she wore. To her, the votes were already locked in. She didn't realize I had already unraveled everything behind the scenes. By 1:45, Vanessa accepted a glass of water from the assistant Trevor had arranged. It wasn't the water she thought it was. I leaned against the window, watching as she sipped from the glass. Her hand trembled slightly, but she chalked it up to nerves. Michael stood by the door, glancing at me discreetly. "It's starting," he mouthed. I nodded. By 2 p.m., the meeting was underway. Vanessa sat beside me, calm and poised as the agenda was read aloud by Daniel Royce, our company's lead counsel. I watched her carefully, the way she sat straighter when Item 3 appeared on the agenda. CEO performance review and structural changes. "This is it," she whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. I smiled faintly, keeping my gaze forward. Vanessa was about to make her move. "Before we proceed," she said suddenly, raising a hand, "I'd like to propose an item for immediate discussion." I leaned back in my chair, fingers laced casually in my lap. "By all means." Vanessa's voice filled the room with a confidence that was almost admirable. "Given the shifting priorities of the company, I believe it's time we reconsider the leadership structure." She spoke carefully, framing her betrayal as a business move. "Jeff has done an incredible job, but I believe his focus has been compromised as of late. For the benefit of Barrett Developments, I propose a vote to transition leadership to a new acting CEO." Murmurs rippled through the boardroom. I didn't stop her. I let her talk. I let her explain how my company needed fresh direction, her direction. But as Vanessa spoke, the drugs began to take effect. Her sentences trailed off, her gaze drifting as if she was losing track of her own words. "Are you all right, Vanessa?" I asked, masking the satisfaction curling in my chest. She blinked rapidly, shaking her head. Yes. She stumbled over the next sentence. A long silence stretched across the table. One of the senior board members leaned forward. "Mrs. Barrett, if you need a moment." "I don't need anything," she snapped, her voice louder than intended. Michael glanced at me, brow raised. "Let's continue," Vanessa said, gripping the edge of the table. But the harder she tried to maintain composure, the worse it became. Her speech slurred, her hands trembled. By the time the vote was called, Vanessa was sweating, eyes darting nervously around the room. "Are you trying to sabotage me?" she hissed under her breath, leaning toward me. I simply smiled. "No, Vanessa," I whispered. "You're doing that yourself." As the final votes were cast, Vanessa's composure shattered. "I know what this is," she blurted, slamming her hand against the table. "You're all working against me. Jeff set this up." Her accusations filled the room, drawing uncomfortable glances from the board members. I nodded to Michael. "Call the paramedics," I said softly, loud enough for those near me to overhear. "Vanessa hasn't been well." 2 paramedics arrived shortly after, as if by coincidence. "She's been under a lot of stress," I explained calmly. "I think she needs to be evaluated." Vanessa fought them, but the drugs made it easier to restrain her. She shouted as they guided her from the room, wild-eyed and slurring protests that no one believed. By the end of the day, she was in psychiatric evaluation under falsified reports I had arranged with Daniel weeks earlier. Her name was removed from any executive discussions. Our divorce, already in motion, would proceed swiftly. And Vanessa Barrett, the woman who thought she could tear me down, faded from the company she once tried to steal. Vanessa's screams still echoed in my mind long after the boardroom had emptied. She had fought the paramedics with every ounce of strength left in her, spitting accusations and threats that no one took seriously. The board watched in uncomfortable silence as she was escorted out, whispering amongst themselves, carefully avoiding my gaze. By the time she arrived at Ridgeview Psychiatric Facility, the sedatives had taken full effect. I made sure of that. Ridgeview wasn't just any facility. It was a private institution, tucked away on the edge of the city, discreet and secure. The kind of place where inconvenient socialites disappeared for exhaustion or nervous breakdowns, only to emerge months or years later, shadows of who they once were. Vanessa Barrett wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. I met with Dr. Alan Pierce, Ridgeview's chief psychiatrist, 2 days after Vanessa's admission. His office overlooked a sprawling garden that Vanessa would never see. "She's been combative," Dr. Pierce said, flipping through her chart. "Delusional, paranoid. Classic symptoms of a breakdown. You were right to bring her in, Mr. Barrett." I watched him carefully. "And you understand she's not ready to leave." "Not for a long time." Pierce nodded, closing the folder with a soft thud. "Of course." With proper treatment, it could take months, possibly longer, for her to regain stability. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. I'll make sure the facility's donations continue. I expect your full cooperation in her care plan. Pierce smiled thinly, understanding the weight behind my words. She'll receive all the attention necessary. That was the last conversation we needed to have. I left Ridgeview that afternoon with the certainty that Vanessa's fate was sealed. She would remain under heavy psychiatric evaluation indefinitely, her every attempt to reach the outside world intercepted by the staff. Letters would never leave the facility. Phone calls wouldn't happen. Vanessa was gone, and no one was coming to save her. Lucy and David adjusted surprisingly well. Vanessa's absence didn't weigh as heavily on them as I thought it might. Lucy asked questions at first, innocent inquiries about where Mom had gone and when she was coming back. She's getting help, I explained gently over dinner one evening. She needs to rest for a while. Lucy frowned, poking at her pasta. Is she sick? I nodded. Something like that. David, too young to understand, simply accepted it. He seemed happier, more relaxed without the tension that Vanessa brought into the house. I filed for sole custody the following week. With Daniel Royce handling the legal side, the process was swift and quiet. The court barely hesitated before granting full custody. Vanessa's psychiatric hold was evidence enough of her inability to care for the children. Her parental rights slipped through her fingers just like everything else. Vanessa's financial accounts were frozen shortly after her admission. Daniel ensured that any joint assets were shifted entirely under my name. Her personal accounts? Wiped clean. I permitted a small monthly allowance, barely enough to cover basic needs at Ridgeview. The facility billed me directly for her care, and I made sure that any excess income she might have claimed was redirected to hospital expenses. I left her nothing beyond what was necessary to keep her from starving. Vanessa Barrett, once draped in designer dresses and sipping champagne at Chicago's elite parties, now lived on hospital food and faded gowns provided by the institution. The press eventually moved on. The articles that once chronicled her breakdown faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals. People whispered for a while, but the city forgot her as quickly as they had once praised her. She had become a ghost. With Vanessa handled, it was time to clean up the rest of the mess. Derek Klein had slipped under the radar after the board vote, but I wasn't about to let him walk away unscathed. Michael and I arranged a quiet meeting with Trevor in his office late one evening. Derek's been moving assets offshore, Trevor said, handing me a thick file. Through a network of shell companies in the Caymans. Classic evasion tactics. He thinks no one's watching. I smirked, flipping through the documents. He's wrong. The next morning, I made a call to my contact at the IRS, Daniel Harrington, a man with an eye for high-profile tax cases. You'll want to take a look at this, I told him, forwarding the files. I think you'll find it interesting. Harrington didn't ask questions. Within days, Derek was flagged for tax fraud. His assets were frozen pending investigation, and Barrett Developments formally severed all ties with him. The last time I saw Derek, he was packing his office, his face pale and drawn. I hope it was worth it, I said, pausing in the doorway. Derek didn't answer. It wasn't. The house felt different in the weeks that followed Vanessa's departure. Lighter, quieter. Lucy and David grew closer to me in ways I hadn't expected. Lucy often sat in my office after school, sketching while I worked, while David helped Michael inspect new development sites. Michael became more of a fixture in their lives, a steady hand and a voice of reason. One evening, as we watched the sun set over the Chicago skyline from the balcony, Michael sipped his drink thoughtfully. You ever think she'll get out? He asked, not needing to specify who he meant. I took a long breath, staring at the distant lights. No, I replied. Vanessa made her bed. Michael nodded, swirling the ice in his glass. Good. She doesn't deserve another chance. I agreed. Vanessa wasn't coming back. The empire she had tried to dismantle stood stronger than ever. The Barrett name remained intact, and the future, without her, felt brighter than it had in years. 5 years is enough time to forget someone. Enough time for life to smooth out the sharp edges of betrayal, for memories to fade into shadows. I hadn't thought about Vanessa in months, maybe longer. She had become a ghost in our lives, a distant mistake I rarely revisited. Until I saw her again. It was a cold November afternoon, the kind that sunk into your bones. I had just finished a site inspection for a new development in one of Chicago's less polished neighborhoods, a gentrification project aimed at revitalizing the West Side. Michael was with me, flipping through blueprints in the passenger seat as I drove down South Ashland Avenue. "You think this is worth it?" he asked, glancing out at the rundown blocks passing by. "There's opportunity here," I replied. "Besides, these areas always flip eventually. Someone just has to get the ball rolling." Michael grunted in response. We stopped at a red light near an old strip mall. Most of the storefronts were boarded up, but a few remained open. Laundromats, pawn shops, and a bistro with flickering neon lights that read Tony's Diner. Michael looked up from the blueprints and squinted toward the diner. "That place still open?" "Barely," I replied. "That's when I saw her. Vanessa." She stepped out of the bistro, carrying a plastic bin full of dirty dishes. Her hair, once perfectly styled, hung in loose strands around her face, streaked with gray. She wore a faded uniform, too big for her slender frame, and a pair of old sneakers that looked like they were held together by duct tape. For a moment, I wasn't sure it was her, but as she wiped her hands on a rag, glancing toward the street, our eyes met. Vanessa froze. The bin slipped from her fingers, clattering to the ground. Plates shattered, but she didn't seem to notice. Michael straightened in his seat, following my gaze. "Is that?" "It's her," I said quietly. Vanessa looked away first, bending down to gather the broken pieces, as if pretending I hadn't seen her would erase the moment. The light turned green, but I didn't move. "Jeff?" Michael asked, watching me carefully. I exhaled slowly and pressed down on the gas. We drove past without another word. Later that evening, I stood by the balcony of my home, watching the city lights blink in the distance. Lucy was practicing piano downstairs, and David was sprawled on the couch, engrossed in a video game. Their laughter drifted up faintly, grounding me in the present. But my mind lingered on Vanessa. I poured a glass of bourbon and sank into the leather chair by the window, staring at the skyline. Vanessa had once been part of this world, our world. She had worn diamonds, designer dresses, and smiled for the cameras at charity galas. Now she was washing dishes at a failing bistro, surrounded by people society forgot. And I felt nothing. No pity. No satisfaction. Just nothing. The following week, I returned to Tony's Diner. I told myself it was out of curiosity, nothing more. Michael didn't ask questions when I mentioned the detour. The diner was as run down inside as it appeared from the street. Cracked linoleum floors, flickering fluorescent lights, and a handful of patrons scattered in booths, nursing cups of coffee. Vanessa was behind the counter, wiping down tables. She didn't notice me at first, her focus on scrubbing away stains that refused to disappear. I stepped toward the counter. "Coffee," I said, my voice even. Vanessa glanced up, and the blood drained from her face. For a moment, she just stood there, clutching the rag in her hands. Then, without a word, she poured the coffee. Her hands shook slightly as she set the cup in front of me. "You look different," I said, watching her carefully. Vanessa didn't meet my eyes. "Time does that." I sipped the coffee. It was bitter, burnt, fitting, somehow. "Do you know how long you spent at Ridgeview?" I asked after a long pause. Her grip tightened around the rag. 3 years. "And now?" She glanced around the diner. "This is all I could get." I leaned back, studying her. "What about the people you used to know? Derek, Brandon. Any of them reach out?" Vanessa's expression hardened, her eyes flickering with something I hadn't seen in years, shame. "They forgot about me the second I left," she muttered. I nodded. I had expected as much. "Lucy and David?" she asked quietly. "They're doing well," I replied, swirling the coffee absent-mindedly. "Lucy's thinking about applying to Northwestern next year." Vanessa's lips twitched, almost a smile. "She was always smart," she said softly. "She still is." Silence stretched between us. I reached into my wallet, pulling out $100 bill and placing it on the counter. "For the coffee." Vanessa hesitated. "I don't need your money." "It's not for you," I replied, standing. It's for Tony. He should really get the heating fixed in here. I walked out without another word. I didn't return to Tony's diner after that. Vanessa faded back into the background of the city, and I let her stay there. Life continued. Lucy got into Northwestern, and David joined the Travel Soccer League. Barrett Developments expanded to new cities, and Michael officially became COO. Every now and then, I wondered if Vanessa ever thought about the life she once had. But if she did, it didn't matter. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for being here. Don't forget to subscribe to Cheating Storytelling so you never miss an update on more real-life stories. And as always, see you in the next video.